All right, so now we're recording. All right, let's get going. So I'd like to acknowledge the Wiradjuri, Ngunnawal, Gundungurra and Biripi peoples of Australia, who are the traditional owners and custodians of the lands on which Charles Sturt's campuses are located, and pay respect to their elders, both past and present. You might like to jump into the chat and introduce yourself if you would like to do that, and let us know whose land you're on at the moment. So welcome to the 6 research seminar for June. We've got 3 lovely speakers today. We've got Dr. Kasey Garrison, Dr. Oddone and Krystal Gagen-Spriggs, and they are doing a presentation which they will present in a couple of weeks' time in Rome for a conference. So this is their dress rehearsal, and it's great to hear from them. So Dr. Oddone is a lecturer and the course director for the Master of Education Teacher Librarianship. Her research interests include connected and networked learning and information and digital literacies. Dr. Kasey Garrison is a senior lecturer in teacher librarianship and the coordinator of the children's specialisation at Charles Sturt University. Her research interests include diversity in children's and young adult literature. Krystal Gagen-Spriggs is a lecturer in the teacher librarianship and is also a PhD candidate with us at the school. Her research focuses on the influence of the teacher librarian on school reading culture, and together they make up the Master of Education Teacher Librarianship team at the School of Information and Communication Studies. So today they're presenting on the topic of From Books to Bots, Scaffolding Ethical and Critical Use of Generative Artificial Intelligence. So they'll present for about 30 minutes and then there'll be an opportunity for questions and discussion at the end. If you've got any questions that you'd like to pop in the chat along the way, we'll save those up until the end and then we'll work through them. So I will hand over to the wonderful Triple K team. Thank you.
Yay. Actually, we're called the Special K.
The Special
Jenny,
K.
but that's okay.
It's all very good.
Yeah, so thanks so much, everyone, for coming to our session today. And as Jane said, this is kind of our dress rehearsal for the presentation we're going to be doing in a few weeks. So please, at the end, if you have some feedback about the style of our slides or just some of our main points, please do share that with us so we can make it bigger and better. And yes, as Kay noted, all of the images, except I guess the next one, are generated by AI, which is very appropriate. And this cute cat its purpose and inclusion will become known later in the presentation too. We're not meaning to feed into any crazy cat librarian stereotypes. And I will just say we all have 3 dogs. So next slide, please, Kay.
Okay, I'm clicking. There we go.
Okay. And yeah, so I wanted to just acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands where I am today and where I live in Panerong, which is the land of the Gadigal and Birigal peoples, and pay my respect to elders past, present, and extend that respect to any First Nations people here today. And I'm seeing lots of you noting the countries where you're from are coming from today too. So that's really great. And yeah, we will be sure to do that in our presentation in Rome too. So yes, this is the slide that is not AI. These are real humans. And yeah, just a little introduction slide for us from the Masters of Education Teacher Librarianship team. This picture was taken at the Australian School Library Association's biennial conference a few months ago with some other familiar CSU faces you might see here, and with our current students and our alumni. And next slide, please, Kay. Okay, so just a little introduction to our research. I really like this image that Kay made with the AI. I think it's super cool. So historically, teacher librarians, which we are going to call TLs throughout this this presentation because we're in education, we love acronyms. So teacher librarians have been leaders in the implementation of digital technologies in schools historically. So they're often the go-to for any tech support, especially in smaller schools or schools without any specific tech department. I think back in the day, I used to help with the overhead projectors and things like that. So it's probably come a bit farther than that. I don't know. I'm hoping they maybe aren't using those anymore, but who knows? But so as access to generative AI tools such as DALL-E2 and ChatGPT grows, it's really likely that those who work in school libraries will be expected to develop their awareness about how these tools can be used for teaching and learning, their potential and their implications. And I think many of you would agree, as working in higher education, that we're seeing that here for sure. Kay and I are doing some research which supports this idea in secondary schools. A lot of teacher librarians we've been interviewing have been talking about how students are using AI for their assignments and policies are being developed around these ideas. So, for example, some people are saying that teachers are only not allowing kids to do work at home. They're making them do it in class so they can really monitor that use and make sure they're not just throwing it into the AI to do for them. So there's obviously lots of ethical implications around using AI, and that's another important aspect of the TL's role in schools. So now when we started this research, it was about, well, we started kind of designing it in January, and I think it was just about December when ChatGPT was released and a few other things. It's been under a year basically since all of this stuff has begun being more at the forefront and more, I guess, accessible for everybody. So this research is exploratory. There's not been any research investigating the implication of these tools for the role of the teacher librarian. And we're using a case study approach and the systems technique of CATWO to explore 3 different freely accessible generative AI tools and the following research question on our next slide. So how can teacher librarians use generative AI tools to scaffold student skills as critical and ethical users and creators of information? Okay, we'll get on to our lecture.
Okay, so the literature review has been really interesting to do because there has been a lot, there's quite a lot of literature about artificial intelligence in general, and some very techy literature about generative AI, and now there's an emerging sort of category of research that's looking at generative AI and the implications for education, and basically not much at all on the role of the TL and generative AI. But I just present where we're positioning our research and the literature landscape that we're situating it in. So in terms of what is artificial intelligence, there is no definition of what AI is, and it's not one particular tool. It's an umbrella term that describes technologies that are capable of using human-like thinking, not human thinking, but human-like thinking, to solve problems, including processes such as learning, adapting, reasoning, perception, and pattern recognition. And there are 3 major categories of AI that are useful to be familiar with, because it helps us perhaps hose down fears that are out of proportion, and it's right to be concerned about the way that these technologies are developing and their implications in the future. But at the moment, there's potentially a little bit too much fear. So we have 3 categories. There's artificial narrow intelligence, which is machine learning that specializes in one area and solves one problem. So ChatGPT, Netflix recommendation system, Siri and other virtual assistants, Google search, these are all examples of narrow AI because they have got one focus area. And even though ChatGPT and generative AI tools like this seem to have the capacity to do lots of different things, when you come down to it, basically what they're doing is they're pattern matching to create a conversational response to a prompt, or to create an image response to a prompt. It's using this very similar category of technologies, and it's not able to apply this its capacities across a whole range of different areas. So it is very good, for example, at generating, say, a recipe, but it can't look out the window, feel the temperature, sense the temperature, make an inference that because it's cold, I might choose soup, then have a look in the fridge, decide what it needs to go and buy. Like, it can't do all of those different strategies all in one go at the moment. That's more in the category of artificial general intelligence, which is machine intelligence, where a computer is as smart as a human across the board. And at the moment, the main examples of that we have are from popular culture, like the Terminator and the machines in the Matrix. That's what obviously the technology is working towards, but it's apparently, according to what's officially published, we're not there yet. And then finally, the ultimate is artificial superintelligence, which is pretty scary. And that is machine consciousness, where a computer has an intellect much smarter than the best human brains in almost every field, and is virtually indistinguishable from a human brain with emotions and consciousness. So that's, for example, the characters in Blade Runner or in the new Westworld, not the old Westworld, not the original Westworld with Yul Brynner. That is perhaps where we're headed, perhaps not, but we're nowhere near that yet. So at the moment, we're still in the category of narrow intelligence, according to what the experts in the field are telling us. Whether they have secret things happening in the background and they're further advanced than we are aware, who knows? But generative intelligence is a type of AI that has a specific task of creating new content, including text, images, or music. So one of the most well-known examples is ChatGPT, and it derives its name from its architecture. It's a generative pre-trained transformer. It's a type of large language model, and it's basically trained on vast amounts of text-based data. It's learning from this data, but essentially it's pattern matching. So it's learning the patterns of language and then creating those patterns again in response to a prompt that someone enters. So it's not actually thinking about the prompt and choosing an answer. It's matching the most likely answer that it feels, having been exposed to so much information and text. And that's basically similar to how the image generators, they work in a separate way. They work on a different type of technology, but they're not replicating and mashing up bits of paintings. They're actually generating patterns of bits in a way that they've learned that is very commonly used through what it's been trained on. The most recent version of ChatGPT, GPT-4, which you need to pay for, is also able to respond to visual prompts. So you can take a photograph of, say, what's in the refrigerator and upload it, and it will analyze what's in the refrigerator and suggest a recipe that, based on what you've got in the fridge. So it can make those sorts of connections because it can interact with photos or diagrams and visual prompts. But there's also many other different types of generative AI image generators like Stable Diffusion and Midjourney. There's Synesthesia, which generates video avatars who can speak up to 120 languages. There's Amy and Jukebox, which generate original music. And the research at this point suggests that the capabilities of these models are limited only by the resources, including the data and the computing power that are available to them. So it's very reasonable for us to expect them to continue to improve. They've improved quite radically so far, thanks in some degree to their exposure to us. Every time we use ChatGPT, the free version, we're essentially helping them develop to see how it's going to react and to refine it further. So it's important that we remember that this is just a sandpit along the way, that this isn't the final product, and that we may not even interact in an interface like we are at the moment, that it's much more likely that it's going to be underpinning other technologies and that we're interacting with them through other apps, and that these are just the engines that kind of drive the underlying workings of the app. So in terms of education and generative AI, AI has been in use in education for quite a while, and there's been AI in student-facing, teacher-facing, and system-facing avenues. And there's been research in terms of how to use AI in education for over 50 years. But the development of generative AI and the release of ChatGPT and the way that it has really come to the forefront in terms of the general public's exposure and engagement to it has prompted a lot of the discussion around academic integrity, around the way that these sorts of technologies are going to impact on information seeking, on critical thinking, the implications for ethics and privacy and data ownership. And there's also a growing awareness that it's already and will increasingly underpin our engagement with information, and it will influence everyday decision making. So it already does to some extent. When we decide what we're going to watch on Netflix, we're being impacted and influenced by algorithms. It may be that it helps us decide what we're going to eat for lunch based on what is in the fridge, or it may help us choose our lunch when we get Uber Eats or something like that, because the different selections pop up on our screen. But it's also life-changing decisions such as who'll be employed, who'll get insurance, who'll be sent to prison. Those things are really quite huge ethical boundaries for us to wrestle with. And so it's really important that we start developing in education teachers that are AI ready and that are able to help students to understand the impacts on society beyond just straightforward learning. Yeah, definitely a Black Mirror episode. I think it was too. So being AI ready, I really like this term from Luckin et al. It means teachers are able to support students learning from, with, and about AI. And the reason I like it so much is because it's not just focusing on using one particular tool in one particular way or using a particular iteration of AI as it exists right now. It's looking at a much bigger picture. So helping students learn how to use AI safely and effectively, but also how to understand the way AI works and the importance of ethical and informed use. And finally, there isn't really any research. There's quite a few articles and podcasts and discussions about TLs and AI and generative AI, but there's not really any research per se. However, as Kasey said, TLs have long been leaders when it comes to introducing new technologies. And we like to try and encourage our students to take this attitude that's described by Branch and Mueller and de Groot as being fearless, playful, and connected, because they really are in a position where they have the opportunity to do that because they're not tied to a particular year level, not tied to a particular subject area, and therefore are able to take a perspective that's very different from teachers and leadership in school. So I'll hand over to Krystal.
Thanks, Kay. So in terms of our methodology, we wanted to sort of get as many tools as we could to explore them because of that focus of not just looking at one tool and how you can use one tool, but how you can explore multiple different ones. So we selected 3 tools in total, and we used a qualitative multi-case study approach to investigate these generative AI tools. So we looked at Quillbot, Perplexity, and ChatGPT. So Quillbot is a platform that will paraphrase for you in a nutshell. Perplexity is a tool that will, it's a bit of a search and answer response tool. And then I assume we're all across ChatGPT, but it is the chatbot function. So they're 3 different tools with 3 slightly different focuses. And what we did is we each took one tool each and explored them in relation to the framework for analysis that we used. So our framework for analysis is CATWO, which is where the sad kitty comes into it. So the CATWO framework is a soft systems methodology, which is an action-oriented process of inquiry into problematic situations in the everyday world. It is cyclical and it provides a structure to the process of understanding complex and changing problematic situations, taking different perspectives into account. So we really liked that there was consideration for elements that allow an in-depth exploration of the platforms, including the different perspectives and assumptions these emerging tools generate. We particularly liked that focus because there is a lot of assumptions out there around AI, and particularly in schools and teacher librarians. So CATWO is one of these soft system methodologies and we chose this one in particular, and it has different steps involved. So you have the C, which is customers. We'll go into these in more depth in a minute. Then we've got our actors. We've got our transformation process, we've got our Weltanschauung, worldview, our owners, and our environmental constraints. So if we look at each of them individually, we'll start with the customers. And for us, we are talking about the customers as our students. We wanted to focus on the students as the people who will be receiving the expertise of the teacher librarian in our case, and being a benefit of exploring the tools with the guidance of the teacher librarian. So we focused in as our customers for our students, because that's essentially what we want to do. We want our teacher librarians to understand how they can help our students. Next slide, please. We then looked at our actors. So these are the people who are responsible for undertaking the transformation process. They will act upon the tool. And so we have decided that in our case, the actors are the teacher librarians. We've decided to remove the teachers from this equation because our focus is looking at the teacher librarian's ability to scaffold learning activities for students and in some ways also teachers, but we're focusing on that connection between teacher librarian and student as part of our research. So our actors are definitely the teachers, and they are the ones who will be doing the transformation process. And we've done this with our 3 AI tools. The owners are the people who have control around AI being used in a certain circumstance. So in schools, you're talking about school leadership, such as your principal and other administrators, or potentially school systems, such as a government education department. I think this is particularly interesting because there are different approaches depending on what type of school you're at, different age levels come into play, different government systems have different opinions. So the owners definitely have a big influence over the ability of the teacher librarian to use AI in their schools. And that's something that's really interesting. Next slide, please, Kate. And then we had a look at the environmental constraints. So these are the things that are happening outside the system which impact the purposeful activity. In other words, how the tools might be used. We are sort of thinking around the access to AI platforms and the associated costs, as well as data privacy and security. What's really interesting is the minimum age requirement for these tools. Different tools have different age requirements and different rules. What is even more particularly interesting is how each tool takes the inputted data from the users and how they then deal with that in terms of ownership and privacy. So Quillbot, for example, I find it really interesting that Quillbot, as soon as you put something in, Quillbot then owns that. Whereas ChatGPT, if you put something in, you still own what you put in. So it's an interesting discussion to have with users around what you're feeding into the machine and where your ownership then ends. Next slide, please. So then we have our transformation process. And what we did is we looked at the 3 different tools in terms of comparing them against 3 different ways of transforming and enacting and engaging with information. So we looked at ethical use, investigating plagiarism, and lateral reading. So I'm going to hand over to Kasey, and she's going to dive into the ethical use part.
Yes, thanks, Krystal. Yes, so okay, first thinking about how teacher librarians can teach about AI, which is kind of different than maybe some of the other technologies that we're used to, where you just kind of jump right in and start using an iPad or using some kind of software. I'm actually teaching about the ethical use and the background of using artificial intelligence. So we looked at each of these 3 tools individually here, as Krystal noted, in kind of putting them all together earlier. So with Quillbot, we believe it can be used as a tool to help students develop an understanding of academic integrity. But if the purpose of a task is to evaluate a student's written expression or knowledge of grammar, then using the tool to improve their quality of writing, quality of the written output could conceivably be considered cheating. So we think teacher librarians can use Quillbot to instigate discussions about ethical scenarios, which will help students understand the difference between their performance, so receiving a grade for an assessment, versus the mastery, so learning through completion of an assessment, which is really what the teachers always want anyway, right? The mastery of a task. And then, yeah, the value of the mastery, despite the accessibility of information, allowing that that performance, that increased that grade for their assessment. Next slide, please, Kay. So yes, now using Perplexity. So for Perplexity, teacher librarians can start discussions around content generation and seeking out sources, since Perplexity doesn't differentiate the type of information or the quality of the information. So it presents a good opportunity for students to consider whether there's any bias in the original sources, and then how this bias could be transmitted through their text response. Or they may evaluate whether the sites selected are offering credible information of a high quality in the first case. So this next slide, this is a screenshot from Perplexity, noting some of the information as well. So going through these sites and their background with students would be a really great activity to show them how the responses are generated and the implications behind them. So I guess an equivalent would be something, you know, just talking about the authority behind a source, going through their references, their bibliography, that kind of thing. So making it really transparent with students about how a source is getting their information. This is kind of a similar way. Oh, the next one's fine. Okay.
Yeah.
So yeah, so thinking about ChatGPT and the ethical use of that. And as we said, ChatGPT is arguably one of the most well-known forms of AI at the moment. And there's lots of ethical implications. So firstly, something I didn't know until we started doing this research and was about how this moderation process happens for the AI to remove inappropriate, illegal, or hate-filled or otherwise just unsavory information from the massive banks of data that these large language models are trained upon. So the training, the humans are actually kind of doing this AI training, and they're mostly poorly paid digital workers in the global South. They identify and label this type of information, offensive information, so the AI can learn what it needs to remove in its responses. So the exploitation of vulnerable workers creates a massive ethical dilemma for all users of generative AI. However, for TLs, making students aware of this issue is really important in supporting their development as informed and critical information users, and also just as global citizens. Could you go to that next slide, Kay?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think these discussions around these kind of social justice issues are much broader than just the discussions around how we use information ethically. So ChatGPT or GPT-3 was initially prone to using violent, sexist, and racist remarks, as hundreds of billions of words were scrapped from the internet and to create its linguistic capabilities. But they also poison the data with bias and toxicity. So they developed an AI-powered safety system, which was inspired by Facebook, which could detect toxic language and begin to remove it. So feeding the AI with examples of violence, hate speech, sexual abuse, then the tool learns how to detect those and filtered them out. So this detector was built into ChatGPT and filters out that inappropriate language, as well as scrubbing the text from training sets that are used in the future iterations of ChatGPT. But to get those labels, OpenAI, the company OpenAI, sent tens of thousands of snippets of text to an outsourcing firm in Kenya beginning in November 2021. And much of that text was pulled from the dark web, described situations in graphic detail about child sexual abuse, bestiality, murder, suicide, torture, incest, self-harm, lots of horrible things. For the humans that are doing this scrubbing and this training data to have to see themselves and interact with. So one of the companies involved in this space, a San Francisco-based firm that employs workers in Kenya, Uganda, and India to label data for clients in Silicon Valley like Google, Meta, Microsoft. This company, the San Francisco company, markets itself as an ethical AI company and claims to have lifted people, more than 50,000 people out of poverty. They're paid a take-home wage of between $1.32 to $2 per hour. And even with counseling, it's just a huge human cost in the psychological health of these workers, considering the kind of content they're meant to work through. But on the 1st of May, 2023, the first African Content Moderators Union was voted into existence. And this obviously has huge implications for the cost of the provision of these services, which we're currently just kind of taking for granted. And then on to you, Kay, teaching with AI.
Okay, so a slightly more cheery topic about plagiarism. So basically, there has been a lot of focus on generative AI and plagiarism, but we felt that it was important that we talked firstly about that whole ethical side of things and talking about the big picture of academic integrity before we then narrowed down to look specifically at plagiarism. If the use of Coolbot with its paraphrasing and its summarization strategies, it can be used by students, but it's probably more powerful to be used by TLs to demonstrate what good paraphrasing looks like and to work with students to have them understand that paraphrasing is a really complex skill, and it's asking the writer to reinterpret information from an original source to support the point that they're making, rather than just changing a few words or changing the structure of the sentence so that it's not directly copied from the original source. And we can use a tool like Quillbot to compare, because it gives that side-by-side comparison of basically what is really bad paraphrasing, because it does do just that patch writing. It's not capable of getting that the nuance and the meaning that good paraphrasers are able to draw upon. And so being able to demonstrate this using something like Coolbot is like a first step in teaching students how they can avoid plagiarism and improve their writing. It also helps provides a tool where students can learn more about sentence structure, vocabulary, and an understanding of grammar, which are all skills that are needed for effective paraphrasing and therefore avoiding plagiarizing. Then we've got Perplexity. Now, Perplexity is obviously not really a tool that is designed to be used as a teaching tool for students about plagiarism, but it's another one where you can demonstrate the ways in which these tools present information as if it's been transformed or as if it's original, when in fact it may not be. And in this case, I just put in to Perplexity about what is plagiarism, and you saw that screenshot before. But when it actually presents the information in a and it's got a little hyperlink. When you go to that hyperlink to see the original source, you can see that it's basically taken it word for word with only very small changes. So it's very useful to be able to show how information is taken from a source and then repurposed into that paragraph style presentation, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's something that you can copy and therefore have avoided that plagiarism. It will still come through. And then finally, ChatGPT, which is probably the biggest target, because we are having students who are trying to use it to generate sections or their entire response to different tasks. And what I think is really important here is to realize that school is the first place where most students or most kids encounter the concept of plagiarism through digital citizenship programs, and even through just when they're really young. She's copying me, he's copying my work. Why is that such a big deal? Why does that upset you? Getting that idea of ownership of content, and how it's not right to just copy what someone else is doing without giving the right credit. And so the TL has got an opportunity to take a really proactive approach in discussing with students the purpose of the task and the importance of authenticity when responding to tasks, and also highlighting the ways that these types of tools can be used in the process of writing rather than as a replacement for writing, which is very pie in the sky in some respects, but we've got to aim high and expect the best. And then, you know, human nature will always be human nature. So handing over to Krystal, talking about lateral reading.
Thanks, Kay. So lateral reading, it's something that is becoming more and more prevalent in the information world, and something that I think a lot of teacher librarians are coming to terms with. It's a particular strategy in terms of interrogating what's happening in the information that you're getting, and it's basically about fact checking. So historically, teacher librarians are all about understanding, you know, investigating the source of information on its own, whereas lateral reading encourages you to be able to explore and compare and contrast, to fact check, basically. So when we looked at it in terms of perplexity, this one is really great for teaching about, or teaching with AI for lateral reading, because what it does is that when you put in your question, it then brings back a response that has up to 5 sources to support it, and it links to those sources. So what you could do is, as a teacher librarian, you could get your students to put in a question and then read the responses, and then they could go in and have a look at each of the different sources that Perplexity has provided them with, and check to make sure that the information provided by one source is corroborated by another source. So that comparing and contrasting and the interrogation of sources is absolutely possible with Perplexity. If we look at ChatGPT though, this is where it gets very interesting, because ChatGPT will take information from a whole bunch of different places and synthesize it together, and it becomes a little bit more tricky to be able to compare where it's getting its information from. So it's about, you could use ChatGPT to create a response, but then students would then need to go the next step themselves and go and look at external sources to ChatGPT to find the information, and then pull it back and compare it to what ChatGPT is telling you, and see how right or wrong ChatGPT gets it. So that ability to be able to compare and contrast and interrogate the multiple different sources is what is definitely key here. If we look at the traditional way of identifying the authority of a source compared to where we're sort of moving towards with lateral reading, the CRAP test is something that a lot of teacher librarians have used in the past as a bit of a checklist approach to be able to identify whether a source is credible or not. So it's definitely, so you look at the currency, the relevancy, the authority, the accuracy, and the purpose. And what you do is you look at those different things just by looking at the source that you're looking at, and you decide yourself, is it current? Can I see a date? Is it relevant? Does it sound like it's relevant? Is it authoritative? So you think about who wrote it. Is it accurate? So you're kind of reading going, does it match with what I know? And what's the purpose of it? What's really interesting about the whole ChatGPT thing though, is that when you put something into ChatGPT, it doesn't give you dates. It doesn't show you where it's come from. It doesn't give you an author, so you can't check the authority. It doesn't, it's not always accurate, as we know from those interesting cases that are coming out. Particularly the one that I like is the lawyer who created a whole argument based on what ChatGPT said and then lost. So, you know, it's not always accurate, and the purpose behind it is not always clear either. So the CRAP test is just not going to hold up when we are interrogating these sources, not just ChatGPT, but all of the AI tools, which is where we're sort of moving into this SIFT approach, where you stop and you investigate the source. So you do some deep diving to see, where the information may have come from. And then you go looking more broadly, which is where the lateral reading comes in. You look further beyond the actual source itself, and you see if you can find corroborating information. And then you trace the claims and the quotes and media and everything back to the original context, so that you can kind of confirm what the original said and make sure that it's not being misrepresented. So it really is just good academic practice, which, you know, we're calling lateral reading, and something that you could absolutely teach using these AI tools.
Okay, finally, our last part of the CATWO process was to consider the worldview, or the Weltanschauung. I hope that's right. And this is where it really all comes together. And even though it's not in the same order as CATWO, that spelling, we found that the worldview was important to consider last, because this is how what's really going to determine whether or not and how the TL might implement these particular transformation processes. So the worldview of the TL can substantially influence their decision as to whether they support and encourage the use of these tools, or teaching about these tools, whether they want to talk about these tools in their engagement with teachers and students, or whether they believe that it's important just to lock it all down and limit access and direct students only to databases and other sources which can immediately be trusted and are immediately possibly the preferential way of sourcing research information. The other thing that the worldview of the TL might impact is the extent of their involvement in curriculum planning, and in particular assessment redesign. So as I said before, TLs are really fortunate in their position in that they aren't connected to a particular curriculum area or a particular year level. So they have a bird's eye view of curriculum and pedagogy, and they are really able to take and their expertise in inquiry learning means they're really able to contribute something quite different to the curriculum and assessment process. And there's a lot of discussion about how a move towards inquiry learning and inquiry design means that you can assess learning as it is developing and the process of learning, rather than the final product of learning, which is still not foolproof when it comes to GAI, but it's certainly better than just relying on a final product essay, which is what a lot of schools are currently using as their assessment. The idea that schools are now just saying, we'll keep the assessment exactly as it is, but shift it into the classroom so we can watch you do it, is something that a TL with a particular worldview could potentially have some sway in persuading teachers to start rethinking their assessment, rather than just pretending that AI doesn't exist and making adjustments so that they can keep on doing what they've always done. So that's why we needed to look at the different ways that worldview will impact the implementation. And finally, it's really important for TLs to have a worldview that allows them to feel confident and competent in their role, and to see themselves as leaders within the school, because they really can take a leadership role in the school and can make meaningful contributions to curriculum and digital decisions and information literacy decisions and implementation. But if they don't have a worldview that empowers them to do that, then they're not going to probably make those moves. And this is why I think we're one of the many reasons why we're seeing TLs, fewer and fewer TLs in schools, is that they aren't empowered with this worldview. So it's part of our role as educators of TLs to be continually reminding them and pointing out the fact that they do have this capacity to take this role, and that they need to educate others in that area. So thank you so much for listening. This is the happy kitty at the end, who has learnt all about GAI, and there's the links to the references. I've been compiling lots of resources on a Flipboard if you're interested, and obviously the contact us is for the conference presentation. You all know where to find us.
That's great. Thank you so much. I'm not sure that cat looks much happier, actually.
I know, but when I put in Happy Kitty, it was that, or it was this sort of cartoon one with a really big, like, Joker smile, and that was just too freaky. I couldn't go there.
A bit terrifying.
So I had to stick with the more natural, non-smiling happy. It's happy in its heart.
Sure it is.
He looks concerned about maybe the implications of AI, I think.
Yeah, it's very
But
thoughtful.
what about the implications? Yeah.
So does anybody have any questions? You can either pop them in the chat or you can unmute yourself and ask questions. While you're thinking about that, I've got one. You know how you said that anything you put into Quillbot becomes owned by Quillbot? How does that work if you're feeding it somebody else's work, like an abstract from a couple of articles or something like that?
Well, Quillbot sorry, Krystal, do you want to answer?
No, you go.
Quillbot is designed as, it's meant to help you improve your own writing. So it's not a tool where you're technically meant to be putting in work that doesn't belong to you, because it's not really, it's what it's doing is helping you to summarize or to paraphrase your own work, not other people's. But what I think is more surprising is that lots of teachers would say, oh yeah, Quillbot's a great tool. I tell my students to use it all the time. I just tell them not to go anywhere near ChatGPT. But when you look at the terms and conditions, one of them is potentially more evil than the other. But it's also a reason why you shouldn't put any student's work without their permission into any of these platforms unless you're completely familiar with the terms and conditions and you do have permission from the owner. And a lot of teachers are doing that as well, saying, I put my student's essay into ChatGPT and asked if it had written it, and it said no, it didn't. So, and I'm like, it doesn't know, it can't remember, it doesn't work like that. And even though the ownership's not an issue, you are still putting someone else's work without permission into another platform, and now it's being stored somewhere else on a server somewhere else. It's not ethically correct.
But in Kay, isn't that what we do with Turnitin though?
I have always had major problems with Turnitin, and I have never used it until I've come here and I don't have a choice. Because it is, we have permission from the students, like we make it upfront. We say to them, this is the tool, and I guess they have a right to say if they have any issues, they have a right to say they don't want it to be used, I guess. But I've always had massive issues with Turnitin because it has a huge database of everyone's data. Imagine the PhD data that's new research that has been put into Turnitin in the past that it now has access to. And even though it says that it won't use the data in an inappropriate way or sell that data or anything like that, that's only while the current owners are in place. When Turnitin is bought by Google or Adobe, or those terms and conditions could well change. And so I've always had a massive problem with Turnitin, but there's not much that. It's sort of like putting Google in primary schools. That's a problem too, but let's not go there.
So everyone's heads are hurting, but no one has any questions at this point. Jackie, you said that many teachers are putting student work into ChatGPT. Is that something you've seen happening, yes, or your students have told you? Or?
Well, I have been trawling through a bunch of, sorry, I put my video on. I've been trawling through a bunch of AI and teachers Facebook groups. There's a lot of them, and there are thousands and thousands of teachers in there. That comes up really often, that they're looking for ways of getting ChatGPT to help them assess student work.
Yeah.
And there's all sorts of things wrong with that, and they're just not, and I sort of calmly and politely point out a few of the issues doing that, and it has not occurred to them, or they're a little bit of the, I mean, this is a handful, this is not a study, right? I don't know how many people are actually doing it, but there's enough of them. It's a theme running through these really big groups. It'd be fascinating to research, but they are not thinking of that, student permission. They're not thinking that, my concern as a teacher educator is that they're not thinking that of teaching as assessment as teaching. You need to assess student work yourself in the main to be able to know whether your teaching's working and whether students are struggling and all the rest of it. But yeah, there's enough of it there that my interest, with my ed tech background, my interest was, students and how students are using it, and everyone's sort of running around worrying about plagiarism. Now my concern's shifted to teachers, and teachers we know are overworked and undervalued, and they're looking for ways to use this to reduce work. That one is a big worry to me. and I'm interested to know how school policies are being developed to deal with this, and particularly given the difference in approaches between state schools and independent schools. That's not helping. So yeah,
I'm also concerned about that, and concerned about the policies that are being developed, because some of the policies I've read are not correct, or based on, you know, flawed information. Some of them I have a question about. I'm by far not an expert, but I have a question about policies, and there's a lot of them being published right now from very, very posh private schools that are saying we're being very progressive, we're embracing these technologies, and they encourage students to reference the use of ChatGPT as if ChatGPT is the author. And I do not think that's actually correct. And I think that while being transparent about your use of ChatGPT is a good thing, I don't think having them included as if it's an author in a reference list is the way to go, but that is the way that they're approaching it. And of course, I'm only going to say one more thing, but I'm really biased, but I really strongly believe that if teacher librarians, they are in a really good position with the information background and the education background to be able to be the leaders in this area to help teachers in their schools. And if there was, and there's not, but if there was a teacher librarian in every school, that would be one person in each school who could take a leadership role in this area. But unfortunately, whenever I say that on LinkedIn, people go, yeah, but TLs couldn't do that. They don't do that. They do books.
The attribution thing is interesting, because a bunch of, like, some journals have banned AI, but then others have said you can kind of use it, but again, you have to attribute that use. And I've also seen other universities talking about just requiring attribution in the same way you would any other source, and I think APA even released guidelines on how to do that.
They did.
And
the International Baccalaureate as well.
I was just looking while you were talking, and Google, for the generative AI that's going to be built into docs, Google says, do not attribute this information to us. I'm like, that's interesting. So I don't know whether that means you can't cite it, or they're just trying to say, don't claim that this is something Google said.
Well, I think it's really strange also that we teach students that Wikipedia is a really useful tool for getting an idea of the big picture, and for finding sources that it's linked to, and as a starting point to go further and digging into different sources, but not to reference Wikipedia. Yet we're saying to students to reference ChatGPT, which seems to me like the same thing as referencing Wikipedia.
We've got time, I reckon, to sneak in Yazdan's question.
Right. Thank you very much for wonderful presentation. And I have a comment, actually. You can think about it. And because at the moment we are talking about generative AI, and by generation we mean generating answers. But in near future, you know, the literacy, the main point of literacy is generating right questions. So that's something that education in general will focus on it sooner or later. Who can ask the best question, rather than who can generate the best answer. So
most definitely. And TLs are, again, should be really familiar with a whole wide range of question frameworks and questioning approaches. And the other thing is that prompt engineering, which is becoming at the moment, it may change, but at the moment prompt engineering is the major way that, and being able to teach that is something that it's like an enhanced and slightly diverted way of doing an effective search strategy. So so they're all skills. I just think that TLs are in a really good position to be able to do these things. Because yes, questions are going to be key.
And eventually in this competition between human being and robots, who is the winner? The one who can ask better questions.
Yes, the one who can ask better questions. Absolutely.
Yes,
that's exactly right.
Thank you.
Well, that's a good note to end on. So thank you so much for sharing your knowledge. It's been great to learn. You've sort of like been the shortcut for us. We now know a lot more than we did an hour ago, thanks to all your work. So good luck for Rome, and thanks to everyone for coming along and for the excellent discussion and questions. Thanks so much. We'll see you in a month's time for our next research seminar.
Thanks heaps, guys.
Thanks everyone.
everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Yeah.